In the vibrant city of Seoul, where ambition moved as fast as the neon lights and sleepless nights built quiet empires, a desolate king had crafted a life that many admired from a distance. He was known in elite circles as a man who understood value, land, structures, timing. A real estate developer whose instincts rarely failed him. His name opened doors. His presence closed deals. From the glass walls of his luxury apartment overlooking the calm stretch of the Han River, the city looked like something he had conquered. And yet, the most valuable thing in his life was not something he had built. It was someone who had chosen him, Zara King. Zara was not loud in her love, but she was steady, the kind of woman whose presence brought calm into chaos. She listened more than she spoke, observed more than she reacted, and loved in a way that asked for nothing, but gave everything. Now she carried more than love. She carried life. 7 months pregnant, her movements had slowed, but her spirit had deepened. There was a quiet glow about her, the kind that came not just from motherhood, but from belief. She believed in her husband. She believed in their future. She believed that whatever distance had crept between them would pass. But distance, when ignored, does not pass. It grows. At first, it was subtle. Adesla coming home a little later than usual. A distracted, "I'm tired," when she tried to talk. Phone calls that ended the moment she entered the room. Then it became a pattern. Dinner tables that sat untouched. Messages that went unanswered for hours. A presence that felt absent, even when he was physically there. Zara noticed. She noticed the way he no longer looked at her the same way. The way his attention drifted. The way silence began to replace the small conversations that once filled their evenings. But she said nothing. Not because she didn't feel it, but because she understood something many people didn't. Love sometimes waits. She told herself it was stress, work pressure, the weight of expectations. She chose patience because patience to her was not weakness. It was commitment. Still, something within her, something quiet but persistent, refused to rest. And that feeling followed her on the day everything changed. That morning, Zara had gone for a routine hospital checkup. The doctor smiled, reassured her that the baby was healthy, that everything was progressing well. But as she left the hospital, she felt an unusual heaviness. Not physical, something deeper, as if her spirit was trying to prepare her for something her mind had not yet accepted. She decided to go home earlier than planned. The ride back felt longer than usual. The city outside her window moved like a blur, but her thoughts were sharp, circling questions she couldn't quite form. When she arrived at the apartment building, the lobby greeted her with its usual polished silence. The elevator ride-up felt strangely tense, each floor number lighting up like a quiet countdown. When the doors opened, the hallway was still. Too still. As she reached her door, she noticed it wasn't fully closed, just slightly open. That was unusual. Adesla was meticulous about small things like that. Her hand paused on the handle. For a moment, she stood there, listening. And then she heard it. Laughter. A woman's laughter. Soft, comfortable, familiar in a way that didn't belong. Zara's chest tightened. Her first instinct wasn't anger. It was disbelief. Slowly, almost unconsciously, she pushed the door open. Each step she took inside felt heavier than the last. The sound became clearer, closer, real. And then she saw them. Adesla, standing in the living room, holding another woman, not casually, not distantly, but closely, intimately. The woman, Nari Kim, carried herself with effortless confidence. Her posture was relaxed, her expression calm, as though she belonged there, as though nothing about the moment was wrong. Time didn't stop, but something inside Zara did. She didn't scream. She didn't rush forward. She didn't collapse. She simply stood there, watching. Her mind tried to reject what her eyes confirmed. Every memory she had built with Adesla seemed to flash silently behind her eyes. Laughter, promises, quiet nights, shared dreams. And in that moment, all of it felt fragile, like something that had always been closer to breaking than she had realized. Her hand moved slowly to her stomach, as if protecting the life inside her from something unseen. Still, she said nothing, because sometimes the deepest pain is silent. Before the moment could shift, before words could be formed, the front door opened again. Slowly, deliberately, the sound echoed louder than it should have, and the atmosphere changed. Not dramatically, but unmistakably. Even Adesela felt it. The room, which moments ago carried laughter, now held tension. A man stepped inside, tall, composed, dressed in black. His presence wasn't aggressive, yet it filled the space with quiet authority. Jin Taehyun. He didn't need introduction. He didn't need explanation. The moment he entered, attention shifted. Nari's expression changed first. The calm confidence she wore dissolved instantly. "Appa," she said softly, her voice no longer steady. But Jin didn't look at her. His eyes moved past everything else in the room, until they landed on Zara. And in that single glance, he understood. He saw the trembling hands she tried to steady, the tears she refused to let fall, the strength it took to remain standing when everything inside her was collapsing. Something in his gaze changed. Not pity, recognition. Then his eyes shifted to Adesela, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop. "What is this?" Jin asked. His voice was calm, too calm. Nari stepped forward quickly. "It's not what you think." He lifted his hand slightly. She stopped. Adesela straightened, trying to reclaim control of a situation that was no longer his. "This is my home," he said. "Who are you?" Jin took a step closer, measured, unhurried. "I asked, what is this?" Silence followed, heavy, unavoidable. Then softly Zara spoke. "This is betrayal." Her voice trembled, but it didn't break. Jin looked at her again, and this time, the respect in his eyes was undeniable. Then he turned to Nari. "You knew he was married. It wasn't a question." Nari lowered her head slightly. "I didn't know she was pregnant." That was the moment something inside Zara finally shifted. Not loudly, not visibly, but deeply. Her breath left her slowly, as if releasing something she could no longer carry. What Adesela didn't understand was that the situation had already moved beyond him. Nari Kim was not just a woman caught in a mistake. And Jin Taehyun was not just someone who happened to walk in. Jin was a man who lived by rules most people never saw, but always felt when broken. He believed in order, in control, and above all, in respect, especially toward women. He looked at Adesela, his gaze steady. "You have something many men spend their entire lives searching for." A pause. "And you treat it as if it has no value." Adesela's jaw tightened. "This is between me and my wife." Jin stepped closer, not aggressively, but with finality. "No," he said quietly. "This is your character." The words landed harder than any physical force, because they were true. Zara stepped forward. For the first time, she stood fully between the past and what came next. Her eyes met Adesela's. "I loved you." No accusation, no anger, just truth. "I trusted you, even when I felt something was wrong." Adesela opened his mouth to speak, but nothing came out, because for the first time, he saw her, not as someone who would always stay, but as someone he had already lost. And no apology could reach her in that moment, because some damage doesn't need time to happen. It only needs truth. Zara turned away, and in that quiet, irreversible moment, she chose herself. As she walked toward the door, her steps were steady, but her body felt heavier than ever before. Halfway through the hallway, she paused, her hand resting briefly against the wall. Jin moved instantly, not to take advantage, not to intrude, but to ensure she didn't fall. "Be careful," he said softly. It was the first moment that carried no betrayal. Zara looked at him, surprised by the simplicity of his concern. "Thank you," she whispered. He nodded once, then added, "You shouldn't be alone tonight." It wasn't an order. It was understanding. Zara didn't return to that apartment. That night marked an ending, but also something else. The beginning of clarity. Days passed, then weeks. Zara didn't rush her healing. She allowed herself to feel everything she had suppressed. The pain, the disbelief, the quiet anger that didn't scream, but stayed. She moved into a smaller, quieter space, somewhere she could breathe. Soul continued moving, fast, loud, indifferent, but within her space, time slowed. Jean remained present, never close enough to overwhelm, never distant enough to disappear. He didn't try to fix her. He didn't offer empty words. He simply made sure she was safe. And sometimes, that was enough. Zara began to notice him. The way he spoke only when necessary. The way he listened without interrupting. The way he never looked at her as fragile, but as strong. And slowly, without pressure, something began to grow. Not the kind of love that replaces, but the kind that rebuilds. Adesla tried to return. Calls, messages, apologies filled with regret. But Zara had changed. Pain had clarified what love alone could not. "I forgive you," she said when they finally spoke, "but I will not return." It wasn't revenge. It wasn't anger. It was truth. Months later, Zara gave birth to a baby boy. The moment she held him, everything she had lost felt replaced by something deeper. Jean was there, not at the center, but present. When Zara looked at him, she smiled, not out of need, but respect, and maybe quietly, hope. One evening, by the calm waters of the Han River, Zara stood holding her child. The city lights reflected gently across the surface. Jean stood beside her, not touching, but there. The past no longer held weight. The silence felt peaceful. And for the first time in a long time, Zara felt whole. Sometimes betrayal doesn't destroy you. It reveals who truly deserves your loyalty. The silence by the Han River did not feel empty. It felt earned. Zara stood still, her child resting gently in her arms, his small breathing steady against her chest. The city lights reflected softly on the water, moving in quiet patterns that seemed almost intentional, like the world was reminding her that motion never truly stops. Jean stood beside her as he always did, present, unspoken, steady. And yet, something had changed. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but undeniably. Zara felt it in the way her thoughts no longer drifted backward. The memories of betrayal still existed, but they no longer defined her. They no longer controlled the way she breathed or the way she woke up in the morning. Healing had not erased the past. It had simply given her power over it. She adjusted the blanket around her baby, her fingers moving with instinctive care. For a moment, she watched the reflection of the city again, then spoke quietly. "I used to think love was something you hold on to," she said. Jean didn't respond immediately. He never rushed words. "It is," he replied after a moment. Zara shook her head slightly. "No, I think it's something you protect, even if it means letting go." Jean turned his gaze toward her, not questioning, just listening. And in that quiet exchange, something deeper passed between them, not spoken, but understood. Days began to take on a new rhythm. Zara's world now revolved around her child, feeding, comforting, learning the language of someone who could not yet speak. The small apartment that once felt temporary began to feel like a space filled with intention. Every corner carried meaning. Every silence carried peace. Jin's presence remained consistent, but never intrusive. Sometimes he visited. Sometimes he simply ensured, from a distance, that everything was in order. Zara never asked how he managed to know when something was needed. And Jean never explained, because some forms of care do not require explanation. But life, even when it feels calm, never stops testing what has been rebuilt. One afternoon, as Zara sat near the window, gently rocking her child to sleep, her phone vibrated. A number she had deleted, but never truly forgotten. She stared at the screen. Adesla. For a long moment, she did nothing. Her heart did not race the way it used to. Her hands did not tremble. But something inside her paused. not from weakness, but from memory. The phone stopped ringing. Then, moments later, a message appeared. I know I don't deserve a response. I just need to see my son. Zara closed her eyes briefly, not to escape, but to think. Her child stirred slightly in her arms, and she adjusted him gently, her focus returning to what mattered most. When she opened her eyes again, her decision was already made. Not from emotion, but from clarity. The meeting was arranged for the following day. Quiet cafe, neutral ground, no history, no expectations. When Zara arrived, Adesela was already there. But he didn't look the same. The confidence that once defined him had softened into something quieter, something uncertain. When he saw her, he stood up immediately, not out of habit, but out of respect he had learned too late. Zara sat across from him, her child resting calmly in a carrier beside her. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Adesela's eyes moved to the baby, and everything else seemed to disappear. Is he? His voice trailed. Zara nodded. Yes. Adesela's hand moved slightly forward, then stopped, as if unsure whether he had the right. Zara noticed, and after a brief pause, she gently adjusted the carrier, allowing him a closer look. That moment was quiet, but heavy, not with tension, but with realization. Adesela wasn't looking at the consequences of his actions. He was looking at what he had almost completely lost. He's beautiful, he said softly. Zara didn't respond, not because she disagreed, but because some words didn't need to be shared. I've changed, Adesela said after a while. Zara looked at him, not dismissive, not accepting, just listening. I know saying it doesn't mean anything, he continued, but I needed to say it. Zara's gaze remained steady. Change isn't something you say, she replied calmly. It's something people see. Over time, Adesela nodded slowly. I understand. And for the first time, he truly did. That meeting didn't fix anything. It didn't reopen doors. It didn't rewrite the past. But it did something important. It created a boundary that was no longer emotional. It was clear, defined, and respected. As weeks passed, Zara found herself stepping further into her new life, not as someone recovering, but as someone rebuilding. She began working again, slowly re-engaging with parts of herself she had placed aside. Her strength, her intelligence, her independence. They returned, not as reactions to pain, but as expressions of who she had always been. And through it all, Jean remained constant. But something within him began to shift, not in his actions, but in his awareness. He had always understood control, discipline, distance, but Zara challenged that, not by force, but by presence. She didn't demand anything from him. She didn't try to understand his world. And yet, somehow, she reached parts of him no one else had. One evening, as they sat across from each other in Zara's apartment, the quiet between them felt different. Not distant, but full. Zara watched him for a moment before speaking. You're always there, she said. Jean met her gaze. That's not a question, he replied. It's not, she said softly. A pause. Then she added, but I don't know why. Jean didn't look away. Because you needed someone who wouldn't leave. The answer was simple, but it carried weight. Zara studied him for a moment longer. And what do you need? She asked. The question lingered. Jean didn't respond immediately, because for the first time in a long time, he didn't have an immediate answer. The past had shaped him into someone who didn't rely on needs. Only responsibilities. Only decisions. But now, there was something unfamiliar. Something he couldn't define as easily as everything else. And that realization didn't weaken him. It made him human. Time continued forward. Steady. Unstoppable. But no longer uncertain. Zara's life was no longer defined by what had happened to her. It was defined by what she chose next. And standing at the center of that choice was peace. Not perfect, but real. One evening, as the sun began to set over Seoul, Zara stood once again by the Han River. Her child, now slightly older, more aware, his small fingers curling around hers. Jean stood beside her, just as before, but not the same, because now, the silence between them didn't carry questions. It carried answers they no longer needed to say. Zara looked ahead, her voice calm. "Do you believe people can start over?" she asked. Jean followed her gaze. "They don't have a choice," he said. Zara smiled faintly. "Maybe not," she replied. "But I think some people earn it." Jean didn't respond, but for the first time, he allowed himself to feel it, not control it, not analyze it, just feel it. And in that quiet moment, something settled. Not loudly, not dramatically, but completely. The past had taken what it wanted, but it had also revealed something greater: strength, clarity, and a kind of love that didn't rush, didn't demand, but stayed. Because sometimes, the strongest stories don't end with what was lost. They continue with what was finally found.